Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to understanding the big, complex issues. Today, we're tackling a really substantial piece of legislation, H.R. 1.
That's right.
It's often called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and honestly, it really does earn that big part of the name. It's incredibly broad.
It really is. Sweeping is the word.
Yeah, it touches on, well, almost everything, from your healthcare, your taxes, even how the government itself operates. It's a lot to take in. So our mission today is to try and cut through all that complexity for you. We've done the deep reading, digging into the actual bill text, committee summaries, even some public comments. We want to pull out the most important pieces, the key insights, so you can really get a handle on the potential impacts without getting totally bogged down in the details.
And that's crucial with a bill like this. You really have to look past the headlines and the talking points to see what the policy actually says.
Exactly, because that's where the real world effects are, right?
Absolutely. The details matter immensely.
Okay, so let's do it. What exactly is tucked away inside this one big, beautiful bill? What could it mean for you, for the country? Healthcare, taxes, border policy. Let's unpack it. Reshaping healthcare and social support systems. All right, let's start with healthcare and social programs. H.R. 1 proposes some pretty significant changes here.
It really does. We're talking about everything from who's eligible for certain aid programs to how specific medical services get funded or not funded in some cases.
Not funded. Tell me more about that.
Well, the bill lays out some very clear prohibitions on using federal funds. For example, it explicitly blocks federal Medicaid and CHIP from being used for gender transition procedures.
Okay, that's specific.
Very specific. And there's another major one. It prohibits federal payments from Medicaid and CHIP to what the bill calls prohibited entities.
Prohibited entities, like who?
The criteria seem aimed at organizations like Planned Parenthood, those involved in family planning, reproductive health, and receiving over $1 million annually through Medicaid or CHIP.
I see. So a significant potential funding cut for certain types of providers.
Definitely. It signals a, well, more restrictive federal approach based on specific services offered. This could really change the landscape for access to care for a lot of people.
And you mentioned something about drug pricing.
Yes. Section 44124 targets what it calls abusive spread pricing in Medicaid.
Spread pricing. That's where the middlemen, the PBMs, charge the state more than they pay the pharmacy. Right?
Exactly. They pocket the difference. This provision aims to clamp down on that practice.
Interesting. What about staffing in nursing homes? I saw something about that.
Yes. Section 44121. It puts a moratorium, basically a long pause, on new federal staffing standards for long-term care facilities under Medicare and Medicaid.
How long a pause?
Until January 1st, 2035. So well over a decade before any new federal minimum staffing rules could be implemented.
Wow, okay. So funding restrictions, pricing controls, staffing rules paused. What about eligibility? Who gets these benefits?
That's another major area of focus. The bill definitely tightens things up. It puts stricter requirements on states to, verify who's enrolled and make sure they're still eligible.
How so?
For one, states would have to get address information from the managed care companies they use.
Okay.
And they'd need to do quarterly screenings of Medicaid and CHIP enrollees against databases like the National Change of Address List and, importantly, the Death Master File.
The Death Master File.
Right.
So checking if beneficiaries have passed away.
Precisely. It's aimed at preventing payments for people who are no longer eligible, whether they've moved out of state, passed away, or maybe are even enrolled in multiple places somehow. Preventing fraud and improper payments.
Makes sense. Any other eligibility changes?
Yes. Section 44108 increases how often certain individuals have to go through eligibility redeterminations for Medicaid. So more frequent checks. And Section 44107 gets rid of something called the good faith waiver. This relates to states having to pay back money if they made errors leading to excess payments. Without the waiver, states might face steeper penalties.
So higher stakes for states to get it right.
Seems to be the goal. And then there's a really significant one, Section 44111. It eliminates the requirement for states to provide medical assistance during what's called a reasonable opportunity period.
What's that period for?
It's basically a grace period for people applying for Medicaid or CHIP to provide documents proving their citizenship or nationality.
So if you don't have your papers immediately.
Under this bill, you could potentially lose access right away. No grace period. That could disproportionately affect vulnerable people, immigrants, or even just folks who have trouble accessing documents quickly.
That sounds like a major hurdle.
It could be. And related to that, Section 44112 prohibits federal medical assistance funds, like Medicaid, for certain non-citizens who aren't qualified aliens, with exceptions only for emergency services, children, or pregnant women.
Okay, so tightening eligibility based on immigration status as well.
Yes, aligning it more strictly with federal definitions of who qualifies for benefits.
What about food assistance? Does the bill touch SNAP?
It does. Section 1712 amends the Food and Nutrition Act, and it narrows SNAP eligibility, specifically concerning households with children.
Narrows how?
Currently, having children under 18 in the household generally makes it easier to qualify or stay eligible for longer. This bill changes that threshold.
To what?
It focuses that easier access specifically on households with children up to age 7.
Only up to 7, so families with kids aged 8 to 18.
They might find it harder to qualify or maintain benefits under this proposal. It definitely raises questions about the impact on, working families with older children and overall food security.
Right, that's a significant potential impact. Okay, moving away from assistance programs, what about health insurance more broadly, like HSAs?
Health savings accounts. Yes, the bill actually expands HSAs quite a bit. Section 110204 is a big one. It would allow people who are entitled to Medicare Part A because of their age to also contribute to an HSA.
Really? I thought that wasn't allowed currently.
Generally, no. Being enrolled in Medicare prevents HSA contributions. This would change that for Part A entitlement based on age.
Interesting. Any other HSA changes?
Yes, quite a few. Section 110206 allows lower premium bronze and catastrophic health plans to be paired with HSAs.
Okay, expanding the types of plans that qualify.
Exactly. And Section 110208 is quite novel. It treats certain amounts paid for physical activity, fitness, and exercise as eligible medical care for HSA purposes.
Wait, so you could potentially use HSA funds for gym memberships or fitness classes?
That seems to be the implication, yes. Treating those expenses like medical care. There are also provisions about on-site employee clinics. Section 110207, allowing both spouses to make catch-up contributions to the same HSA. Section 110209, and allowing HSA contributions even if a spouse have a health-flexible spending arrangement. Section 110202.
It sounds like a real push towards HSAs and individual control over healthcare spending.
That's certainly the direction these provisions point. Oh, and one more related point.
Yeah.
Section 110205 clarifies that direct primary care service arrangements are not considered disqualifying health plans for HSA eligibility.
Okay, clearing the way for those models too. What about the ACA exchanges? Any changes there?
Yes, Sections 110201 and 110202 modify some requirements for the premium tax credits and eliminate certain thresholds related to exchange enrollments, though the exact impact needs closer analysis.
Got it. And finally, in this section, you mentioned a new tax.
Yes, Sections 36BE, 2, and 4475 introduce a new 3.5% tax on remittance transfers.
Remittance transfers, so
Yeah.
money people send abroad,
Yeah.
to family, for instance.
Exactly, sending money internationally. There are specific exemptions for qualified remittance transfer providers and verified United States senders, but it's a broad tax otherwise.
3.5%, that could add up. What's the thinking behind that? Revenue, discouraging transfers.
That's the big question, isn't it? The bill doesn't explicitly state the primary purpose. It could be seen as a revenue generator or perhaps as a way to, keep more money within the U.S. border. Its impact could be quite widespread. 2. Financial, tax, and economic policy shifts.
Okay, let's shift gears now. H.R. 1 makes some really substantial changes to taxes and economic rules. What are we seeing here?
Yeah, this section is packed. It's clear the bill aims to sort of recalibrate a lot of financial incentives and also how some key oversight bodies function.
Recalibrate, like changing tax credits.
Definitely. There are several significant tax terminations, especially targeting clean energy. Sections of 1131 through 111055 get rid of various clean vehicle credits.
Which ones specifically?
The credits for previously owned clean vehicles, new ones, commercial ones, also the credit for installing alternative fuel refueling property, like EV chargers, and even the tax credit for energy-efficient home improvements.
Wow, that's a broad sweep of green incentives.
It is. And interestingly, these specific terminations are grouped under a subtitle in the bill, actually called Subtitle, See Make America Win Again.
Okay, so the naming itself signals a policy direction.
Seems intended to. It's a clear move away from those specific federal tax breaks for renewables and EVs. There are also restrictions, sections 1108 to 1110, on who can claim clean electricity production and clean energy property credits.
Restrictions based on what?
They disallow the credits if the taxpayer is a specified foreign entity or a foreign-influenced entity, and the definitions seem particularly aimed at entities connected to countries like China.
Got it. Now, what about this no tax on tips idea? That's gotten a lot of attention.
Right, Section 1101011, this is a big one. It proposes making qualified tips received by employees exempt from gross income for federal income tax purposes.
Exempt completely.
That's the proposal. And if someone receives tips but doesn't report them, it would be treated as a mathematical or clerical error, not necessarily tax evasion.
I heard some numbers mentioned, potentially affecting millions.
Yeah, some public comments suggest this could impact around 16 million workers, mainly in the service industry. It could mean a noticeable increase in take-home pay for those individuals.
That's significant. Are there other income-related tax breaks?
Yes, along similar lines, Section 110102 proposes exempting qualified overtime pay from gross income, too. That would kick in for tax years after 2025.
Overtime pay tax-free as well.
That's the idea. And Section 110103 brings back a deduction, allowing people to deduct the interest they pay on loans for personal use passenger vehicles if the loan was taken out after December 31st, 2024.
A car loan interest deduction. That hasn't been around for a while for most people.
No, it hasn't. So exemptions for tips and overtime, plus a car loan interest deduction. These seem aimed at boosting disposable income for certain groups.
Okay, what about savings? You mentioned HSAs earlier. Any other new savings vehicles?
Yes, Section 1111 Option 3 introduces something called Trump accounts.
Trump accounts, is that the official name?
The official name is Money Accounts for Growth and Advancement, or MAGGI accounts. But yes, Trump accounts is clearly the intended branding.
Okay, so what are these MAGGI accounts?
They're new tax-advantaged savings accounts. Individuals under 25 could contribute up to $5,000 per year. There are rules, though limitations on taking money out before age 18 or 25, and restrictions on what kinds of investments are allowed.
So, targeted at younger savers, is there anything else?
There's also a pilot program proposed, Section 110116, where the Treasury Secretary could actually set up these accounts for eligible children and even make initial government contributions.
Initial contributions from the government. Interesting. Like a starter fund.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
It seems designed to encourage long-term saving from a young age. There are also modifications in Sections 111.101 and 11.1.102 related to qualified opportunity funds and new qualified rural opportunity funds, including new reporting requirements and higher penalties if you don't comply.
Okay, so changes to investment zones too. What about financial regulation itself? Any shifts there?
Oh, absolutely. Some major ones proposed. Section 5002 would rescind funding from the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB.
The audit watchdog. What happens to its duties?
They'd be transferred directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. So basically, the SEC would take over direct oversight of public company audits.
That's a big consolidation of power.
It is. And then there are changes to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. Section 5003 lowers the cap on how much funding it can request from the Federal Reserve System, dropping it from 12% down to 5%.
That sounds like a significant budget cut.
Potentially, yes. It could reduce their funding stream. And Section 5004 directs any excess money in the CFPB's civil penalty fund money collected from enforcement actions to the General Treasury Fund, rather than being used by the Bureau. Similar changes are proposed for the Financial Research Fund, Section 5005.
So less funding independence and maybe less operational capacity for these consumer and financial watchdogs.
That's certainly a potential consequence, yes. It could shift their priorities or limit their scope.
Okay. And one more big tax item, the SALT deduction. State and local taxes. Always controversial. What does H.R. 1 do?
Right. Section 11-2025 tackles out. It proposes reinstating and modifying the limitation on the deduction for individuals.
Reinstating? I thought there was already a cap.
There is currently $10,000. This bill proposes new aggregate limits. $15,000 for married couples filing separately and $30,000 for other filers, like single or married filing jointly.
So a higher cap than the current one.
Yes, but it also includes foreign, real property taxes within that cap and introduces something called specified taxes. And importantly, there's a phase-down based on modified adjusted gross income, so higher earners might not get the full $30,000 deduction.
Ah, okay. So more generous than the current cap for many, but still limited, and phased down for high incomes. Any enforcement measures?
Yes. Section 6659 introduces a new penalty in addition to tax, specifically for what it calls state and local tax allocation mismatch for partnerships. This seems aimed at preventing partnerships from finding ways around these SALT limitations.
Got it. So trying to plug potential loopholes.
Seems like it. When you pull all these tax and financial pieces together,
Yeah.
it really paints a picture of a significant overhaul. changes to individual taxes, business incentives, investment vehicles, and even the structure and funding of the regulators themselves. It's a comprehensive reshaping. 3. Immigration and border control enhancements.
All right, let's pivot now to immigration and border security. This is always a major focus, and it looks like H.R. 1 dedicates a lot of space to it.
A huge amount, yes.
Mm.
Title VII is extensive. And one of the most immediate things that jumps out is the introduction of a whole slate of new fees
Fees for what?
for various immigration processes. And critically, the bill states none of these fees can be waived or reduced.
No waivers at all. That's unusual. What kind of fees are we talking about?
Well, let's see. Section 7008 imposes a fee for processing aliens encountered away from the border, starting at a $1,000 minimum in FY 2025. Section 7009 puts a minimum $550 fee on asylum applications.
A fee to apply for asylum.
Yes, minimum $550. Same minimum fee, $550 for applying for temporary protected status, or TPS, Section 710. Even asking for a continuance in immigration court comes with a minimum $100 fee,
Right.
Section 710.
Okay, those are significant costs for people, often in vulnerable situations. Are there bigger ones?
Oh, yes. Section 716 sets a minimum fee of $5,000 to apply to adjust status to become a lawful, permanent resident getting a green card.
$5,000 minimum. Wow.
And Section 730 imposes a minimum $5,000 fee for releasing an unaccompanied alien child to a sponsor.
A fee to release a child to a sponsor?
A $5,000 minimum fee, yes. And Section 714 sets a minimum $5,000 fee just for being apprehended by DHS.
A fee for being apprehended.
At the time of apprehension, yes, minimum $5,000. And again, none of these can be waived. Plus, they're all indexed to increase annually with inflation.
That fee structure alone seems designed to be a major deterrent or barrier.
The financial hurdles would be immense for many individuals and families navigating the system, absolutely.
Beyond the fees, what about enforcement and infrastructure? Is there funding allocated?
Massive amounts. Section 70101 appropriates $5 billion specifically for border barriers, walls, and related technology. Those funds would be available through September 2029.
$5 billion for the wall and tech. What else?
That same section gives the Secretary of Homeland Security sole discretion over detention standards for single adults. No external requirements would apply.
Sole discretion. Okay. What about personnel?
Big focus there, too. Section 70102 provides $250 million each for ICE and CBP just for retention and signing bonuses in FY 2025, trying to keep and attract officers.
$500 million just for bonuses.
Right. Then there's funding for facilities and equipment. $150 million for IC facility upgrades, Section 70107, $250 million for IC fleet modernization, Section 70108,
Upgrading detention centers and vehicles.
and significantly expanding capacity. Section 70109 provides $1.2 billion specifically to increase detention capacity.
$1.2 billion for more detention space.
Yes, and Section 701N allocates $100 million to facilitate more 287G agreements.
Those are the partnerships where local police help with immigration enforcement.
Exactly. Encouraging more of those. There's also $950 million in Section 70111 to compensate states for the costs of incarcerating undocumented immigrants convicted of crimes.
Okay, funding states for incarceration costs.
And more resources for deportations. Section 7011 provides $1.32 billion for additional ICE support staff and attorneys specifically to represent DHS in removal proceedings, trying to speed up the legal process for removals.
It sounds like a very significant investment across the board in enforcement, detention, and removal.
Unquestionably, it's a multi-pronged approach. Financial barriers through fees, physical barriers in tech, more personnel, more detention space, more legal resources for removals. There are also provisions, Sections 70123 and 70124, aimed at expediting the removal of certain criminal aliens without requiring further hearings.
So streamlining deportations for some.
Yes. It all points towards a policy prioritizing enhanced enforcement, deterrence through cost and consequence, and expedited processing and removal. It really begs the question about the long-term impact on the system, on migrants, and on communities. 4. Energy, natural resources, and environmental regulations.
Okay, let's shift again, this time to energy and natural resources. H.R. 1 seems to have a lot to say here, too, potentially changing how things are done.
It absolutely does. Title 8 covers this, and it signals a pretty clear shift in approach, particularly towards fossil fuel development and environmental reviews.
How so? Let's start with oil and gas.
Well, Section 80101 mandates regular onshore oil and gas lease sales. It requires the government to hold them quarterly on certain federal lands, specifying competitive bidding and setting royalty rates like 12.5% for non-competitive leases.
Mandating sales, so ensuring leasing continues regularly.
Yes. And Section 8102 actually rolls back some recent increases in royalty rates, reinstating lower rates or ranges like 12.5% to 18.75% instead of higher fixed rates set previously.
Lowering the government's take from drilling on public lands.
Effectively, yes. There are also specific mandates for certain areas. Section 80111 requires at least 6 lease sales over 10 years in the Cook Inlet Planning Area in Alaska, each offering at least 1 million acres.
Targeting specific regions for development.
And perhaps most controversially, Section 80112 directs the government to reissue oil and gas leases in the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR.
Reissue ANWR leases. Weren't those canceled?
They were canceled by the Biden administration in 2021. This bill would undo that cancellation and force the government to accept the highest bids received back in January 2021.
Wow. Okay. That's a direct reversal of a previous environmental decision. A clear push for more domestic drilling.
Unmistakably. It prioritizes resource extraction on federal lands quite heavily.
What about the process for approving projects? Permitting reform is always discussed.
Yes, and this bill introduces some interesting mechanisms. First, there are new fees. Section 80103 imposes fees for things like commingling of production, mixing oil or gas from different leases, and for using permits by rule in oil and gas operations.
Okay, new operational fees, but you said interesting mechanisms.
Right. Section 80151 is where it gets, well, potentially game-changing for project timelines. It establishes project sponsor opt-in fees for environmental reviews under NEPA.
Sponsors paying for their own environmental reviews. How does that work?
It allows the company or entity proposing a project to basically pay the federal agency to expedite the environmental review process for their own project. The goal is to complete environmental assessments within 6 months and full environmental impact statements within 1 year.
So industry could fund faster reviews of their own proposals.
That's the framework laid out here. It could dramatically speed up approvals for pipelines, mines, infrastructure, energy projects. But it also raises questions about potential conflicts of interest when the proponent funds the review.
Definitely something to watch. Any other financial aspects related to energy?
Yes, Section 80173 amends the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, GOMESA, which shares offshore oil and gas revenue with Gulf Coast states. It removes previous caps on how much revenue is shared, but then adds a new cap specifically for fiscal year 2025, limiting the total distributed amount to $750 million.
Okay, adjusting revenue sharing from offshore drilling. What about renewables? Any fees there?
Yes, Section 80201 introduces new acreage rent and capacity fees specifically for renewable energy projects, like wind and solar, sited on federal lands. It lays out formulas for calculating these fees and includes penalties for late payments.
So new fees for renewables on public lands, too. Are there any rollbacks of existing regulations?
Quite a few notable ones. Section 42301 explicitly repeals the NHTSA rules, setting corporate average fuel economy CAFE standards for cars and light trucks for model years 2024 through 2026.
Repealing the fuel economy standards.
For those specific years, yes. Rolling back those requirements. Also, Sections 8302 and 8303 prohibit the implementation of certain recent Bureau of Land Management resource management plans in Wyoming and Colorado, likely plans seen as restricting development.
Blocking specific land management plans.
Correct. And Section 8304 rescinds or takes back unobligated funds from the National Park Service.
Taking money back from the Park Service? Any new spending in this area?
Interestingly, yes. Amidst the rescissions and repeals, Section 8305 appropriates $150 million, specifically for celebrating America's 250th anniversary events and celebrations in fiscal year 2025.
Okay, a bit of a non sequitur there, funding for the semi-quincentennial.
It stands out, yes.
So putting it all together for energy and environment, what's the takeaway?
It looks like a very strong push towards accelerating domestic fossil fuel production through mandated leasing and potentially faster industry-funded reviews. At the same time, it rolls back key environmental regulations like CAFE standards and specific land use plans and introduces new fees for renewable energy development on public lands. It's a significant shift in federal priorities, v. higher education and federal workforce policy.
All right, let's move on to higher education and the federal workforce. These are areas that affect millions of students, borrowers, and government employees. What changes are proposed here?
Some really fundamental ones, particularly concerning student loans and the nature of federal employment.
Okay, let's start with student loans. Repayment plans are always a big topic.
They are. And Section 15201 proposes major revisions. Starting July 1st, 2026, the Secretary of Education's ability to create or modify repayment plans for new loans would be significantly restricted.
Restricted how?
They'd essentially only be able to authorize plans that fit the definition of a standard repayment plan, with very limited exceptions, mainly for existing income-based repayment plans under specific older sections of the law.
So potentially fewer flexible or income-driven options for future borrowers.
That seems to be the direction, yes. Less flexibility. Also, Section 1521203 proposes to sunset, or end, eligibility for unemployment and economic hardship deferments for loans made on or after July 1st, 2025.
Ending those deferment options, that could make it harder for borrowers facing job loss or financial distress.
It certainly removes the safety net that currently exists. But perhaps the most innovative or striking changes in Section 15301. It introduces a new accountability measure for colleges and universities.
Accountability how?
Institutions participating in the federal direct student loan program will be required to essentially pay back the government for a portion of the federal loans taken out by students in cohorts who failed to complete their programs.
Wow, so colleges would be financially penalized if their students don't graduate.
That's the core idea. They'd have to remit annual reimbursements based on non-completion rates for qualifying student loans. This starts for the 2028-2029 award year. It's a direct financial incentive for institutions to improve graduation rates.
That's a very different approach. Where does that reimbursed money go?
Section 420S proposes creating new promise grants. These grants would go to eligible institutions, funded by those reimbursements collected from other schools, specifically to carry out activities aimed at improving student success.
So penalizing schools with low completion and rewarding others trying to improve.
Kind of a closed-loop system, yes. There are also provisions aimed at transparency. Section 151.303 requires institutions to determine and disclose a maximum total price for completing a program before a student enrolls and guarantee that price for a minimum period.
Price transparency up front. That could be helpful for students.
Could be. And finally, on the student loan front, Section 151.305 repeals several existing regulations.
Repeals.
Things like the rules around closed school discharges, loan forgiveness when your school shuts down, and the process for borrower defense to repayment, which allows loan discharge if a school misled students or engaged in misconduct.
Repealing borrower defense and closed school discharge rules, that removes significant protections for students.
It would, yes, shifting more risk back onto the student borrower in those situations.
Okay, so big changes in student loans, repayment limits, ending deferments, institutional accountability for completion, but also removing some borrower protections. What about the federal workforce?
Equally significant shifts proposed there. Section 9002 introduces a really fundamental change for new federal civil service hires.
What is it?
It allows them to elect for at-will employment.
At will. For federal jobs. I thought they had civil service protections.
Traditionally, yes, strong protections against arbitrary firing. At-will employment generally means you can be fired for almost any reason or no reason without needing just cause. This option would come with lower employee contributions to the federal employees' retirement system, FERS.
So trade job security for lower retirement contributions.
That seems to be the trade-off offered to new hires who choose this path. It's a major departure from the traditional structure of federal employment.
Huge. What else?
Section 9003 establishes a filing fee for bringing claims or appeals to the Merit Systems Protection Board, the MSPB, which handles disputes over federal employment actions.
A fee to appeal a firing or disciplinary action?
Yes, set at the same amount as filing a civil lawsuit in federal court. The fee would be returned if the employee wins their case, but it's still an upfront cost to challenge an agency action.
Another financial barrier, potentially.
Could be seen that way. The House Budget Committee summary also mentions changes to how the high-five average pay is calculated for older CSRS retirement annuities, potentially lowering payouts, though the specific section isn't listed there. And Section 9004 revises how the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, is funded for developing systems to verify eligibility for federal benefits.
Okay, so looking at higher ed and the federal workforce together.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You see this push for more accountability in higher education, tying funding to outcomes, alongside a move to fundamentally change the terms of federal employment, introducing at-will status, and altering retirement norms. It's reshaping major public sectors. 6. Regulatory oversight and miscellaneous provisions.
All right, we're nearing the end of our deep dive into H.R. 1. Let's cover some final significant areas, looking at how federal agencies operate and a few other notable provisions sprinkled throughout this massive bill.
Right, there are some important pieces on regulatory oversight. Section 7200 focuses on the Congressional Review Act, or CRA.
The CRA, that's the law Congress uses to overturn agency regulations, right?
Exactly. This section mandates CRA compliance, but adds a critical new hurdle specifically for rules that increase revenues.
What kind of hurdle?
It states that a major rule that increases revenues, as determined by the Treasury Secretary, cannot take effect unless Congress passes a joint resolution specifically approving it.
So, any significant regulation that brings in more money for the government needs explicit sign-off from Congress before it can be implemented.
That's the requirement laid out here. It's a potentially significant check on the executive branch's rulemaking power, especially for rules related to fees, taxes, or other revenue-generating measures. It really shifts the balance of power towards the legislative branch on those issues.
That sounds like a major process change. What about other administrative changes?
Section 7300 addresses settlement agreements involving the U.S. government. It limits the ability to direct payments to third parties as part of those settlements.
Meaning?
It prohibits Justice Department officials from making deals where settlement money goes to non-victim third-party organizations, say advocacy groups or research institutions. The idea is to ensure settlement funds go directly to victims or to the U.S. Treasury. It also requires audits of these agreements.
Okay, tightening the rules on where settlement money flows.
Well, precisely.
Now, this bill is so huge, there must be other miscellaneous items tucked away. What else caught your eye?
Oh, plenty. It's incredibly diverse. For instance, back in healthcare, Section 111201 expands the definition of a rural emergency hospital under Medicare.
Helping more rural hospitals qualify for that designation and associated payments.
Potentially, yes, allowing more facilities to fit the criteria. Then there's Section 100.004, which imposes a new federal registration fee on motor vehicles.
A federal fee just to register your car.
Yes, starting at $25 in FY 2025, adjusted annually for inflation after that. And 75% of this revenue goes to the General Treasury Fund. States that don't collect it could face withholding of federal highway funds.
Wow, a new nationwide vehicle registration fee with teeth to enforce it?
Quite a departure. There are also more rescissions. Section 106 takes back unobligated funds from programs supporting alternative fuels, low-emission aviation tech, and clean transportation corridors.
More rollbacks of green initiatives.
Seems consistent with the earlier sections. But then Section 107 appropriates a lot of money, $3.5 billion for FY 2025, specifically for air traffic control staffing and modernization. Facilities, equipment, hiring, a major investment there.
Okay, so funding for ATC modernization. Anything else on transportation or security?
The House Budget Committee summary flags Section 1001, providing $1.5 billion in FY 2025 for Coast Guard assets, specifically aimed at securing maritime borders and interdicting migrants and drugs.
More funding for border security, but this time via the Coast Guard.
Correct. And flipping back to taxes, Sections 109 and 110 extend and modify an existing tax credit for employers who provide child care assistance, and they also reinstate the partial deduction for charitable contributions for people who don't itemize their deductions.
Bringing back the non-itemizer charitable deduction. That was popular during the pandemic years.
It was. This would reinstate it. And Section 101.111 introduces a new way to support K-12 education through the tax code.
How does that work?
It allows individuals to get a tax credit for contributing to scholarship-granting organizations, or SGOs. These SGOs then provide scholarships for students to attend K-12 schools, explicitly including private and religious institutions. There are specific rules for how SGOs must operate.
So a federal tax credit incentivizing donations for private school scholarships.
Essentially, yes, promoting school choice through the tax system. And finally, Sections 11.6 and 11.7 extend some provisions from the 2017 tax cuts. The increased exemption amounts for the estate and gift tax, and the higher thresholds for the alternative minimum tax, AMT.
Extending those higher exemptions, that primarily benefits wealthier taxpayers, right?
Generally speaking, yes, it reduces potential estate tax liability and keeps more people from being subject to the AMT outtrip.
Okay, wow, that was a lot. We've covered a huge amount of ground trying to unpack H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
We certainly have. It lives up to the name, doesn't it? This year's scope is just immense.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's try to recap just a few of the biggest takeaways. We've seen this bill touch, well, almost everything. How you save for retirement with things like Maggie accounts, how you pay for healthcare, HSA expansions, funding cuts for certain providers.
Right. And major shifts in who qualifies for programs like Medicaid and SNAP-P, plus those significant new non-waivable fees for immigration processes, alongside massive funding boosts for border enforcement and detention.
And then the huge changes in energy policy mandated oil and gas leasing, including ANWR, rolling back fuel economy standards, the potential for industry-funded environmental reviews.
While terminating clean energy tax credits. Plus, fundamental changes proposed for student loan repayment and accountability, and even the nature of federal employment with that at-will option. Not to mention the tax changes like no tax on tips, the SALT cap modifications, and the new remittance tax.
That's just incredibly far-reaching. When you look across all these different areas, what's the thread that ties it together for you? What really stands out after digging into all this?
I think it's the sheer ambition of the reorientation. It's not just tweaking things around the edges. In area after area healthcare funding, social program eligibility, energy development, environmental regulation, tax incentives, financial oversight, immigration enforcement, higher ed accountability, federal employment, it proposes really fundamental shifts in federal policy direction and priorities.
Yeah, reorientation feels like the right word. It's attempting to significantly reshape the role and function of the federal government across so many domains.
Which inevitably leads to a crucial question, doesn't it? In a bill this massive, this interconnected, designed to fundamentally alter so many different systems all at once.
Yeah.
What are the potential unintended consequences? How might these sweeping changes, designed perhaps with specific goals in mind for each section, interact with each other in ways that ripple through the economy, through society, in completely unexpected ways?
That's definitely something to think about. The potential ripple effects of such a complex and comprehensive piece of legislation. Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a much clearer picture of what's actually in H.R. 1.
We hope it provides a solid foundation for understanding the discussions and debates that will inevitably continue around this bill.
Exactly. A shortcut to being truly well-informed. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.